Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, and thanks to our people on Zoom, the Zoomers. And so I'm going to introduce our speaker very briefly because she's well known here on the occasion by Judith Brett of the book Fearless Beatrice Faust, Sex, Feminism and Body Politics, which has just come out. And I think Judith is here for the 5th time. Last time spoke on Alfred Deakin. But she's a political historian, a biographer, emeritus professor of politics at the University of La Trobe in Melbourne, and about to speak for us here tonight. Thank you, Judith.
Right, so Beatrice Faust, I've just written this book about, is best known as the founder, early in 1972, of the Women's Electoral Lobby. She was active from the mid-60s in the campaign to decriminalise abortion and in civil liberties, where she argued against the censorship of what adults could read and watch about sex. And like her contemporary at Melbourne University, Germaine Greer, she was very comfortable talking and writing about sex and its pleasures. She'd hoped to be a literary academic in the mid-1960s. There was lots of jobs around, but she didn't. That prospect disappeared, and around 1970 she decided that she'd become a freelance writer and what was later called a public intellectual. She would practice critique and promote the public good, that's her words, with the clarity recommended by George Orwell in his 1948 essay Politics in the English Language. She would do this through books, reviews and features. Now in 1970 this was a realistic ambition, with this is one of her early articles, with new weeklies like Digger, the Carlton-based Digger, and I put that up because it gives you a sense of the sort of countercultural printing. Basically, offset printing came along in the late 60s and it greatly changed the possibilities of journalism. And so student and countercultural newspapers were possible. And they wrote a lot about sex and drugs and Vietnam War and the theatre. So she started writing for Digger, for Nation Review, the National Times, and the broadsheet newspapers were generally increasing their use of freelance writers at the time. She served 2 stints as photography reviewer of The Age, and in the 1990s, which was, I think of as the decade of the public intellectual, she had a regular column in the focus section of The Australian, alongside B.A. Santa Maria. By the end of the 90s, as the digital revolution destroyed newspapers and magazines' advertising base, such an ambition was no longer possible. Trawling through the microfilms, which is a necessity when you're researching the second half of the 20th century because it falls in a sort of gap between Trove, which goes up to 1952-3, and the 2000s when things start being digitised, you've got to basically read microfilms. But what it reminded me of, I was in fact astonished in many ways to remember how much space the broadsheet papers gave to serious debate. B's journalism quickly gave her a public profile, and she was regularly invited onto television panel shows to discuss issues to do with sex and feminism. Issues such as lesbianism, rape, pornography, the differences between men and women's experiences of sex and paedophilia. Now, I'll come to those later, but I want to now say just a little bit more about the Women's Electoral Lobby. Now, the idea behind the Women's Electoral Lobby was relatively simple, as many brilliant ideas are. It was to survey the political candidates for the 1972 federal election on their position on various issues of central concern to women and then to publicise the results. Initially, the surveys were posted to candidates, but very few returned them. So the decision was made to interview the candidates, to send pairs of women out to interview them, one to do the interviewing and the other to write down what they said. This necessitated a rapid recruitment and the establishment of interstate branches. 2 of the early recruits were aged journalists with bylines, Iola Hack, who later married Race Matthews, and Sally White, and they helped publicise the Women's Electoral Lobby through the media. And in Victoria, Sally White had something of a coup when she persuaded the editor of The Age, Creighton Burns, to include a special lift-out just before the election. And this is a lift-out, it was on green paper, "Think well before you vote." That's their slogan. And this was just about a week before the election. So Well had really established itself as a public presence by then. Now, over the next few years, the Whitlam government's then elected in December 72. So over the next few years, with a sympathetic national government, Well grew into a powerful lobby group for feminist issues. The Canberra branch, in particular, was well situated to lobby the federal government, though the state branch has remained important because many of the restrictions on women's lives were actually at the level of state laws and regulations, not just federal. Now, compared with much of women's liberation, which was also getting going about this time in the early 70s, Well was a reformist project. It wasn't attempting to overthrow the patriarchy, but to position women's concerns high on the mainstream political agenda and to achieve practical reforms to improve their lives. Scores of women joined that first year, and for many, it changed their lives. Now, Bea died in 2019, and some of the women from those early days thought she deserved a biography. I received an email from Iola Matthews inquiring if I knew of anyone who would be interested. It was 2020, it was in the middle of the Melbourne lockdown, second lockdown I think. I didn't have any project on the go, so I put up my hand. I thought, well, I've got the research skills, I know how to write a book. Like the life of Alfred Deakin as well, it was a Melbourne story, and I feel I understand Melbourne. I would never dare take on a Sydney person. I don't understand the way the city works in the way I feel I understand Melbourne. And it also overlapped with my life. I was born in 1949, so that's a decade after Bea. So I'd long been interested in the women half a generation or so older than me who left their girlhoods under one set of expectations, carefully groomed and marrying young, put up with the condescension of their male peers and the unequal opportunities of the workplace, and then broke out as adult women, becoming feminists, leaving their marriages, fighting for change, forging careers and reputations. Brought up under one structure of feeling, they created a new one from which I and my peers benefited. Now, for me, this was a very different biographical project from the previous ones on Robert Menzies and Alfred Deakin. A biography of a Prime Minister needs no justification. Their lives are self-evidently of national significance. There's a rich public record, and one hopes there'll be a ready readership. Bea is a minor feminist, political activist and public commentator from the late 1960s through to the 1990s. She's not a transformative feminist like Germaine Greer, with whom she was at university. Does she warrant a biography? Who will read it? So my answer to these questions is that many people read social and political history through biography. So Bea's life would be a way to tell the story of second-wave feminism and of 1960s and 1970s sexual liberation. Though there was a surprise for me in this story, something I hadn't anticipated. As I read her early writings from the early 60s and looked at what she was doing in the early 60s, I realised that her political activism owed as much to humanism and the civil liberties campaigns of the early 60s as it did to 1970s feminism. She was 10 years or so younger than the young women's libbers who took to the streets. She was 10 years or so older than the young women's libbers who took to the streets in the 1970s with their long hair and their hippie skirts. And she already had a decade of political activism behind her. And as I said, her activism was not directed towards wholesale social changes and the overthrow of the patriarchy, but to practical, achievable changes in the laws and regulations which limited what women could do in their working, family and sexual lives. Like the humanists and the civil libertarians, she placed her faith in lobbying politicians and in rational argument to change public opinion, rather than in confrontational protest politics, and she had no sympathy for radical separatism. A further reason for writing her biography was that her life intersected with key questions about sex and feminism in the decades after the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and some of these are still perplexing us. So I hope that the book would not just be of historical relevance, but would have contemporary relevance. Now, what the biographer can do depends a good deal on the available evidence. I made arrangements with the trustees that were managing her estate to visit her house in Gippsland and remove material. I took what I thought was relevant, which included around 2 decades of diaries and copies of her letters to friends. She kept copies of her own letters. She didn't keep copies of the letters people sent to her. Political activists and intellectuals are public roles, and they leave their traces in the public archive. But this private archive that I got transformed the project, giving me insight into her emotional, sexual and intellectual life. Now, all biographers are voyeurs on the lives of others, but few would have access to as much about their subject's sexual desires and disappointments as I did, nor to their deep fears and insecurities. B wrote frank accounts of her sexuality in various places, so I had no fear of unwarranted intrusiveness or of breaching the restrictions of the privacy legislation. For her many lovers, dead and alive though, it was a different matter, so I respected their privacy. And I haven't named people that whose names weren't already on the public record. Now, 3 quotations guided my thinking about the intersection between B's life and her times and ours. The first is from the political psychologist Harold Laswell, who was a pioneer in the study of political psychology. The quote is, "The political activist solves for others what they cannot solve for themselves." Now, B's mother was a Catholic who refused medical advice on both contraception and abortion, and she died 12 hours after her baby was born. Her mother's death was the defining fact of B's life. The motherless child was sickly, with chronic lung disease and incipient scoliosis. B believed that her father blamed her for his wife's death and that she was unwanted and unloved. A stepmother arrived when she was about 4 and B hated her. She also believed that her physical ailments, as well as her androgynous sexuality, that's how she described her sexuality, had begun in the womb of her anxious mother. Now, there was nothing she could do about her mother's death, but she could work to ensure that other children were not born unwanted and unloved as she felt herself to be. The fate of unwanted children, rather than a woman's right to choose, was the emotional core of her commitment to the decriminalisation of abortion. Here she is speaking at a rally for reform of the abortion law in Sydney in 1975. The woman on the far left looking at you is Julia Freebury, who was very active in the Sydney campaigns for abortion law reform. And I don't know who the woman in the middle, the blonde in the middle is. If anybody recognises her, I'd be pleased to know who it was. B's concern with unwanted children was supplemented by a rationalist's argument that the laws against abortion were unenforceable, that whatever the law, women would seek them out, and so they should be safe and accessible, both to prevent women's death and injury and to remove incentives for corruption and medical profiteering. As well, their unenforceable illegality encouraged negligence and corruption in doctors as well as in the police. B's campaign to decriminalise abortion was also informed by her own experiences and that of her peers. By the time she started university in the late 1950s, young people's sexual behaviour was changing as the moral authority of the church declined and access to cars offered privacy. Even though she used contraception, B had 3 abortions before she was 25, and in one of these she believed the doctor had risked her life by operating on her without resuscitation equipment to hand, even though she was a chronic asthmatic. Many young women of B's generation had abortions, but for most these were matters of shame and secrecy, and few told their mothers. B had no mother and she wasn't ashamed. On a TV debate on the issue in the late 1960s, a fellow panellist asked B if she'd had an abortion. One of the other panellists, Father Eric Darcy, who was later the Catholic Bishop of Gippsland and who also lectured me in first year philosophy at Melbourne University, he said chivalrously, "You can't ask that." But B was unfazed and announced that she'd had 3. My second quote then is from the American author Bell Hooks. "Queer is not about who you are having sex with, but about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. Bea described herself as a sceptical feminist, not an ideological feminist. She didn't fit the standard second-wave feminist template, and the friction she experienced with feminism of her day reveals fault lines that are still with us. She wasn't somebody who settled easily into the sisterhood. She rubbed up. She didn't agree with all of the feminist orthodoxies. She felt that her sexual style was more masculine than feminine, and she felt that gave her a perspective from which to understand men, and that's why she describes herself as having an androgynous sexuality. She had a high need for sex. She was easily aroused. She responded to pornography, which most women don't, and she enjoyed sex with no emotional expectations and involvement. So she was more sympathetic to men than the average feminist, and she reacted against what she saw as a strain of misandry, the opposite of misogyny, in much feminist thinking. Now, sex is a biological category and gender a social and cultural one, laying down socially acceptable and desirable conduct for both sexes. Bea didn't dismiss the importance of socialisation and cultural expectations in shaping men's and women's lives and sense of themselves. Nevertheless, she argued that the social construction of gender built on biological foundations, which was at odds with the feminist orthodoxy of the 70s. And this is probably her best book that was published in 1980, Women's Sex and Pornography, which is an exploration of the differences between men and women's experiences of sexual pleasure. Now, she was no simple essentialist. She recognised that there is both variety and overlap, and that cultures differ in their construction of gender differences. But she insisted that biology was part of the story. She believed that for her and for her mother, biology had been a sort of destiny. So when the women's movement started mocking biology, she thought it was wrong. She also rubbed up against feminist orthodoxy in her scepticism about one of the slogans, big slogans of the social movements of the 60s and 70s, the personal is political. Now, one of its meanings, and what I always thought it was meaning was, but evidently talking to people, there's other meanings, but was that it held out a promise that if you changed society, your personal problems would disappear and you'd be happy. Now, Bea never believed that. She always said that the personal was also psychological. She was extremely intelligent. She was confident and compelling public speaker and a good organiser. And many of the women that I've talked to about her were in awe of her, and they saw her as sort of formidable. But her diaries and letters revealed a very different self who struggled with feelings of worthlessness and depression and had suicidal thoughts. Politics couldn't bring back her mother, and her death and its consequences were the wellspring of her unhappiness, as I've said. But Bea wanted to be happy. She was of the intellectual generation convinced by existentialism that even when circumstances seem most compelling, one still has choice, and to evade that is bad faith. She would not be a victim of her miserable childhood, of the patriarchy, of her imperfect body, and she worked hard to learn how to be happy with the tools that were to hand to her in that period. And I was very interested in that as a sort of historical question. How did people experience depression and misery in the 70s and before it gets as medicalised as it has been now? She sought out psychotherapists, and she applied the insights of Eric Berne's transactional analysis to her own life and those of her friends and lovers. She did yoga, transcendental meditation, and she did use drugs to alleviate symptoms of her anxiety, but she didn't medicalise their cause. When in the 1980s, she inadvertently became addicted to benzodiazepine, she was furious, and she wrote her last book, Benzo Junkie, on that. Now, today, Bea would likely be seen as suffering from trauma-induced mental illness, but that's not how she saw herself or would have described her own depression. Now, my last quotation is from George Orwell, and it's one that Bea used in a letter to one of her friends, and it's this. The cartoon is by John Spooner, and it was in The Australian.
Really? What year?
It'll be in the book. I think it's about It's sometime in the 80s, I think. Each generation imagines itself more intelligent than the one before and wiser than the one that comes after. This is an illusion. One ought to stick with one's own worldview, even at the price of seeming old-fashioned. To abandon it is to kill one's intellectual roots. Now, some of B's views are deeply offensive to much contemporary thinking, which imagines itself in matters of sex to be much wiser than the libertarian 60s and 70s. And I'll just discuss two of these, her views on rape and on paedophilia. B didn't agree with feminists like Susan Brown-Miller, who she went on a TV panel with, that sexual relations between men and women were all about power, and that fear of rape is used by men to keep women subordinated to male power, so all men thus benefit from the actions of the few who rape. A generalisation like this was a red flag to a rationalist like B, and on the Monday conference panel they were both on, she cited evidence of women who rarely thought about rape, of men who feared it from other men, and much more. She didn't agree that sex between men and women was just or always about power. Sometimes it could be just about sex. And she didn't dismiss the seriousness of rape as a crime, but she argued that all rapists are not the same. Some rape is the result of a failure of communication between the man and the woman, particularly when they're young, and of their mutual incomprehension of each other's sexuality. She says, I know women don't ask for it, as some men think, but they do invite it in ways that women's lib won't face. She believed that unwanted sex in situations where consent was at least possible could be eliminated with better sex education. And that's one of her sort of campaigns, always for better sex education. So this, she's not dismissing the horror of violent rape and murder, but she doesn't see it as the primary locus of women's oppression compared with their lack of financial independence and high rates of poverty. So again, here what you've got is you can see the origins of her thinking in civil liberties and humanism. It was a rational utilitarian argument, a calculus of harm. But arguments about mutual responsibility can look very like blaming women for arousing men and open her to accusations of victim blaming. And they put her offside with feminists whose top priority was violence against women. And they would put her offside today with aspects of the Me Too movement and a view of consent where a woman can say no at any stage of a sexual encounter. Now, even more difficult in the contemporary context is her writing and speaking about paedophilia, which became a public issue in the early 1980s, around the same time as homosexuality was being legalised. Over the next 2 decades, B said and wrote things that are now barely sayable. To B, it seemed that there was a demonising and repressive impulse behind the sudden public concern with child sexual abuse, and the civil libertarian in her was alarmed when men in a Melbourne paedophile self-help group were arrested for what they thought, even though they'd committed no crimes. The Walesers, she wrote, had lost their major battles on abortion, contraception, fornication, masturbation and homosexuality, and were losing the battle against the legalisation of prostitution. Child pornography, child prostitution and child molestation were all they had left in their crusade to control human sexuality. They're her words. Now, as in the way she argued about rape, she challenged generalisations, drew distinctions and looked for evidence. Child sexual abuse, she said, was an umbrella term which obscured differences between the experiences of boys and girls, between children's sexual contact with strangers, blood relatives like fathers and brothers, friends of the family, and with people in positions of trust like clergy and teachers. It didn't distinguish between forced and unforced contact, between pubescent and prepubescent children, or various types of contact. It also ignored differences in young people's sexual maturity and libidinal energies. Child abuse, she wrote, became an inchoate toxic cloud, and youthful consent to sexual experience with adults becomes unthinkable. Now, she was particularly exercised around issues around the age of consent for post-pubescent adolescents. And here she's drawing on her own experiences to some extent. When she was 16, although she said she looked much younger and she was always in her school uniform, she had a relationship with a much older man, who's probably in his 30s, she thought. And although she said she thinks probably he must have been a paedophile because she looked younger, but she said it was erotic bliss, and it was a very important relationship to her in the middle of that time, and she felt that she had sexual agency in this. During the 80s and 90s, as evidence emerged of the extent of the emotional and sexual abuse of children and adolescents in institutions and by teachers, priests and others in positions of authority, and as sexual abusers faced the courts and survivors testified to life-destroying harm, it became difficult to imagine and impossible to say that some such encounters might sometimes be benign or even beneficial, and that some young people might be sexual agents rather than traumatised victims. So even though she recognised harms and injuries, today B would likely be cancelled. But she always said what she thought. But I have to say that I found that chapter it was quite difficult to write, to sort of get to try to explain where she's coming from, but to also write into a contemporary period where we have a different understanding, particularly of the harm that this can cause for people. So to conclude, as a feminist who wasn't really at ease with the sisterhood, B's life attests to the range of ideas and experiences that fuelled second wave feminism, as well as the sexual liberation that preceded it. It's hard for societies to get the balance right on sex. Too much repression is harmful, as is too much licentiousness. The needs and desires of men and women need to be balanced, individual differences accommodated, and violence and depravity confronted. And whatever the prevailing norms, not everyone's going to be happy. We need to be able to talk about this, to discuss issues around age, consent, sexual assault, victim blaming, gender identity, and more without being told, you can't say that. We need to be open to evidence and argument, to different points of view and experiences, and we need to be kind. Most readers today will not agree with all of B's conclusions about human sexuality and will want to argue with her, but we should welcome the openness and seriousness she brought to this fraught area of human experience.
In your talk, you mentioned intellectual influences, but in your book, you mentioned that she fired up and started on her campaign of being a public intellectual after reading Frank Knopfelmacher's chapter in his book, Intellectuals and Politics. So
yes.
Are we to blame Franta for all of this? I mean, is he the ones responsible?
Look, I think the people responsible, if you want to blame people, is the English department who didn't give her a job. After she wrote a pretty good MA that went to 5 examiners. There was obviously a difference of view about her, about the MA. But, you know, she was an intellectual and she was a very good literary scholar. But she didn't get a job, and so she went back to, she did school teaching, and then she read Knopfelmacher's essay, you know, on politics and public intellectuals and thought, that's something I can be. And as I say, like one of the things when you're writing a biography, you know, you've got to trace the arc of the life and the way particular moments in the life when there are choices intersect with the choices that are available at that time. And it seemed to me that in the early 1970s, it was actually possible to imagine that you could live as a freelance writer, and that's what she did.
Look, I'd like to thank you for giving such a splendidly nuanced treatment of B, because obviously she didn't fit the template, and I think it's great that you brought out the nuances of her take on things. And I should say I was in touch with her from 1968 to a few months before her death, over 50 years.
Oh, thank you. No, it's just, I'm pleased if somebody who knew her, because I knew of her growing up and at Melbourne University. I mean, Gerard must have too.
I knew of her, yeah. But only in the intellectual sense.
Yeah.
You knew of her, not
Yeah.
Now we go to the end and Tom.
Okay, thank you, Judith. This is a bit tricky, actually. Just hearing what you said about what B said about queerness, I'm just wondering what she would be saying nowadays to this whole transsexual thing that seems to be destroying the lives of many young people.
Yes, I mean, that's interesting. I looked in her writing, the relevant material I could find was two reviews she did. One was of a memoir or an autobiography written by Alison Ashley, who was one of the first people to have, have the operation to change her gender in about 1960, and then it was a complicated, and it's quite a sympathetic review to the sort of. And the other she wrote was a book called A Boy Named Brenda, where a boy baby had his penis damaged badly during a circumcision, right? And then the solution of the consulting psychiatrist was, don't worry, Dr. Money, we'll whip the penis off and we'll bring him up as a girl. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was terrible. And the child kept saying he was a boy, and he looked like, had interests. So she has a view that there's a sort of a range of intersex types, and that some people experience gender dysmorphia. So she wouldn't be, but on the other hand, she also thought I think what she would think is that there needs to be some sort of biological basis for people's experience of gender dysmorphia, that it's not just a sort of a cultural or performative issue, or that you feel different or something. I mean, that's how, she becomes very interested in endocrinology. So the biological differences would not just be about the genitals, it would also be about what the hormonal balance was. And she had there was some test you could do where you had your hormones analysed, and she discovered that she was sort of more masculine, had made her feel that, that on the spectrum. So I think, but she would be sceptical, I think. She'd be wanting to look at evidence but also to be sympathetic, because it's obviously an area, people don't do this lightly, where, But,
sorry, I stole the microphone from Tom. But I'm just wondering if related to, related to this question, was your implication, I haven't read the book yet, but I will, is the implication that you think Beatrice would have called herself queer today, or been sceptical of that term?
Oh, no, I don't think she would have. She might have, but not necessarily. It was just that when I came across that quote, and it was saying that it's not about sexuality, but about this sense that you don't fit in, that who you are rubs up against a whole lot of things. She never felt... Yeah, so that was what I was saying. I don't think... look, she thought... she writes a bit at times about, she thought she should have had a lesbian relationship because that was fashionable amongst feminists in the 1970s. But then she said, well, I'm not that attracted to women, sex is about pleasure, not politics. So I don't know.
Judy, you mentioned that Bea went to university with Germaine Greer.
That's right, yes.
What was the nature of Bea's relationships with Germaine Greer in the 70s and 80s and 90s? And to what extent did she complement or even contradict Germaine's views on sex and feminism?
Okay, well, they're at university at the same time in the late 1950s. And Germaine is in a tutorial with Bea's first husband, Clive Faust, that she gets the name from. And they were quite friendly, but they both only got 2 A's for their honours degrees. This seems arcane. Any of you who were at university in the 60s will know that, people would be described as having 2 A minds and first class minds and 2 B minds and, and stuff. So anyway, if you got a 2 A, you were pretty good, but you weren't top you weren't star quality. So Germaine took her and did an MA in the University of Sydney, where she got a first, and that enabled her to get a Commonwealth scholarship and go to Cambridge and have an academic career. So B thought she might be able to do something like that. So she enrolled in an MA and did an MA on Henry Handel Richardson, which Susan's read for me, and it's really pretty good. I mean, compared with what counts as, in those days an MA was a substantial piece of work. Most people didn't do PhDs in the humanities in Australia. They then went and did a PhD overseas. But I couldn't, the university doesn't keep the examiner's reports, so I couldn't find any examiner's reports. But she does describe how it went to 5 examiners, so I suspect that meant there was a fight about it. So Germaine was a model in some ways for her. She wanted that, and she felt that she was a more rational, careful thinker than Germaine was. She was quite critical of Germaine. So I'd say her, but she was also then quite envious. I mean, she wrote in 1970, she writes to Germaine and congratulates her on the book on the female eunuch coming out. But Germaine doesn't reply, and B's very hurt by that. But then when she comes out in Germaine's trip in 72, B chairs one of the press conferences and is around. But she calls what's it called? The female primate is the name she gives to the first book she's trying to write, which is obviously this is in the early 70s. She starts this book called The Female Primate, which is clearly a criticism or to provide a different view of women's sexuality from the female eunuch, right? But they don't have a lot to do with each other. B reviews her books, but she does quite a glowing, affectionate review in the National Times of The Female Eunuch, and then she does a really critical review in The Humanist. Well, I think one was more sort of journalistic, and it was. She kept calling her Germs, which was what what she was called at university, and it's sort of it's claiming a personal knowledge of Germaine, back to that friendship. So it's a sort of celebratory piece, but she's much more critical in The Humanist, which is a more sort of philosophical and to a much smaller audience. So I think I would say it's a combination of envy and impatience with her sloppiness.
I'll go to Anne after this. One of our Zoomers down in Melbourne sends in a text. She said, Judith Brett seems to be talking about what these days might be called a difficult woman, she says.
Yeah.
And she adds, what about her private life, and did she end with many friends?
Yes, no, look, she did have friends. There's quite a lot of letters, but she also did fall out with friends, particularly when she felt misunderstood. And because she was difficult and she was complicated. She could be warm and charming and kind. Like I did an interview with Morag Fraser, when Morag took on an editorship of Farrago as the first young woman to have that position, she said B, took her to coffee and she said she was very kind. So, but she did get not so much offended as feel misunderstood by people. And I think that what the explanation there is to do with, the fact that she didn't have a mother, that she had some issues with attachment, so that she finds it hard to trust that people will stay friends with her even when there's differences, That's...
Back on the difficult woman. Looking at both her and Germaine, was her problem that Germaine never quite had the dysfunctionality in her life. And if you look at what you've written about her, about the time her book, is it Sex, Pornography and Women came out, it was a big moment for her. But her life was falling apart. Her health was falling apart. She was falling out with friends. And that seems to be a pattern in her life, whereas Germaine could be cranky and crazy, but she also never seemed to have that dysfunctionality. But in all of this, the difficult woman, some of our progress, to my mind, is that those difficult women were the ones who got the attention and moved things forward. Can you take all of that as a question?
Yeah, but I also think, I mean, if you look at Germaine, you know, she's strong and vigorous. I mean, Bee's health issues were serious. And because by the time you get to that book comes out, she's got serious arthritic pain. But I also think that she takes this benzodiazepine, I think it's Ativan she takes, as an anxiety medication, which, because some of the other medications interfered with her asthma. And she had a couple of near-death experiences with asthmatic attacks. But that seems to me, that's when her life fell apart. I mean, her second marriage comes apart then because she's becoming addicted without understanding that that's what's happening. And she's getting pretty poor medical support at that point. But I think you're right. I mean, that's one of the reasons she's interesting, because when people don't fit in, their lives can tell you more than the people who sort of find a niche and snuggle in and get on with things.
Thanks very much for tonight. To what extent do you think that she's a product of Melbourne? And I asked that question seriously.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Her rejection by Melbourne University impacted her life and her life choices, her decision to become a public intellectual. I can't imagine anyone in Sydney at the time thinking that they should become a public intellectual. So I wonder the extent to which she's a product of Melbourne.
Yes, well, and so two things I'd say. The first is after her relatively, a difficult childhood, and I think she's pretty, I have to say, I think she's too hard on her father. I think he was an emotionally damaged man himself, but she doesn't, like she's just a little child. But what saves her is a McRobb, which was a selective girls' high school in South Melbourne. And I would say, when I'm in a book club with somebody who went to McRobb, and when I said, oh, well, it saved Bee's life, and this woman who'd been a refugee, children of refugees, she said, well, it saved my life. I think it saved the lives of clever girls born into not particularly intellectual families, and gave them a sense, because the women there really, the teachers wanted the girls to have a sense of the possibilities of careers and things. And I think probably the Melbourne University English department at that time, she would have been better off at Sydney because she had a more historical and biographical interest in literature, whereas Melbourne was at that stage very Leaversite, wanting moral conclusions and moral dilemmas, and that was where it was what she did in her thesis on Henry Handel Richardson, was to place Richardson's writing into the history of European realism, and so it was that. So Sydney was much more sympathetic to that sort of historically situated readings. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember.
Well, as a final question, tell us about her final years. I think she moves to Gippsland. Was it Moe or Morwell?
Churchill,
where
the arsonist came from. Chloe Hooper wrote a book called The Arsonist, where then there were those terrible fires.
Yeah, okay, So she goes to Churchill, and how many years is she there before she dies?
Okay.
And when does she die? 2019?
Yeah, she dies in 2019. After the benzodiazepine addiction and then the withdrawal, which had made her cranky and ill, her marriage breaks up. Now, when she'd become a public intellectual, yes, she was making a certain amount, and a freelance writer, she was making a certain income from that, but it wouldn't have been enough really to live on. And her second husband was a lawyer, so, that that was sort of the financial underpinning of her life. The marriage broke up, so she had to get a job. She felt she didn't have much of a CV. She had a teaching degree. She's actually a very good writer and editor of this at the small piece level. So she eventually got a job at Monash Gippsland, which had the campus in Churchill, which was doing sort of teaching support and editing of materials for off-campus students. It was that sort of a, not a sort of discipline-based academic job, but a sort of teaching support. And so she does that for about 12 years, and then there's a restructure, and whatever the section she was in gets restructured out of existence. I suppose many academics have had this experience. But she stays living in Churchill. I mean, she did in one letter to somebody say, look, I think I made a mistake, in staying here after I retired, because it was a long way from her Canberra networks, and she becomes increasingly reclusive. And I sort of decided when I was thinking about planning the book, that basically she stops being a public person, really, once she finishes, like the column in The Australian is the sort of end of her public life, and that there wasn't really any particular public interest or any insight for the fact that, she became a sort of reclusive, not very well old lady.
Many thanks. Many thanks for a great talk tonight. Copies of the book available outside. Well done, an important person by an important speaker, and we'd love to have you back sometime. Well done for tonight.